All right, good morning, everyone. It looks like folks are ready to go. I'm pretty impressed. So, my name is Joe Smino. This is my first meeting as chair here, taking over for Spud. Glad to see you here, Spud. Thank you for 2 great years rolling through and cleaning up a lot of policy stuff for us. So, we'll be starting our executive committee. We've got a pretty tight agenda here, but I do want to open it up for any additional items. One thing, Erica, you don't have to rush. I'll give you time to get here. One thing we will talk about in other business is we'll talk about the annual meeting coming up. That isn't on the agenda yet. And we will be doing a closed session when we get to other business as well to talk about a few items. And I'll let Bob discuss that. And I'll turn it over to Erica. I know you have something for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to add an item under other business to discuss the potential for the commission to send a letter regarding fishery disaster requests and NOAA's interpretation of the new law to the agenda today.
Okay. Yeah, we got that. We'll add that, and I think we could cover that before we go into closed session. Okay. All right. So. Where are we, Bob? So with that, I guess with those additions, if we're okay, we'll approve the agenda unless there's any objections. And our meeting summary from the annual meeting, and if there were any issues, if not, we'll move on from there. Okay, great. And I don't know if there's any public comment. Listen, we have nothing against Alexander. For those of you that may have noticed, he's not up here with us. And certainly would love to have him up here with us, but we seem to have run out of room a little bit. So sorry about that, Alex. We know you're not here for public comment, but I don't see any other folks for public comment at this time. Okay. And then we'll turn it over to you, Alexander. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be providing an update on the legislative committee and what we've been talking about recently, and an update on the status of appropriations and some information on some productive meetings that Bob and I have had up on the Hill recently. Congress has had a particularly unproductive year so far. Last time I checked, they've only passed 29 bills. Usually at this point, they would have likely passed 70 plus bills. These 29 bills include bills such as, for example, a bill to rename the post office in Harrington, Maine after Pat Kelleher, stuff like that. We're technically on our 4th continuing resolution, which funds the government through the beginning of March. If the appropriations process follows the agreements made in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is no guarantee that they will, FY24 non-defense discretionary funding will receive a 1% cut. There may be a full year CR limiting budgets to FY23 levels, and we will likely enter into FY25 appropriations planning immediately after passing FY24 appropriations. On to some productive meetings that Bob and I have had recently. On January 8th, we went over to the Hill and talked to a couple different members whose districts are not on the East Coast. We met with Representative Huffman's staff of California, Peltola's staff from Alaska, and Garrett Graves' staff from Louisiana. We were informed that Representative Huffman is going to introduce a Magnuson-Stevens Act reauthorization bill in the next month or so. It'll largely be the same as the bill that was introduced in the 117th Congress, and it'll include some of Representative Graves' amendments, but we aren't exactly sure what those are yet, and Representative Graves' staff also did not know. They've removed changes to National Standard 8, given NOAA's ongoing rulemaking process. National Standard 8, for a reminder, is the portion of Magnuson that talks about communities, who's defined in a fishing community, who participates in a fishing community. Hoffman's staff said that they don't see the bill being approved in the 118th Congress, but this is an opportunity to drum up conversation around an effort that will be furthered in the 119th Congress. In the 119th Congress, they're planning on holding a listening tour again, and they said that they would share the draft bill with us as soon as it's available. Representative Graves and Peltola are thinking about bundling a number of fisheries-related bills on topics that they think progress is needed, but in a format that is smaller than Magnuson and has a better likelihood of passing. They're calling it a fish minibus. This fish minibus would contain bills such as the Fishes Act, which is what Bob testified on, related to improving the fisheries disaster process and putting a timeline on OMB. It would likely include a working waterfronts bill and a bill to establish a seafood office at the USDA and others. We don't have the full details of that bill yet. They also said that they would share that text with us as soon as it was available. We met with Representative Graves' staff to discuss MRIP and any potential changes that they would like to make regarding MRIP. They've been active in addressing red snapper down in the Gulf, so we thought that they might be interested in addressing the uncertainty around MRIP and the overestimation. We were right. Graves' staff is in the final stages of drafting a fisheries survey reform bill, and will share it with us as soon as it comes out. It has two sections to it, a fisheries dependent section and a fisheries independent section. The fisheries dependent section will address MRIP, and the independent section will address fisheries surveys and stock assessment timeframes. Our conversation focused on the MRIP section. For the dependent section, they will be using the Gulf programs as a model for bottom-up management. MRIP will remain the baseline, but there will be a grant program to augment and enhance state management and its incorporation of data into the MRIP program. The bill would address percent standard error. With anything over 40%, it would be referred to the National Academies of Science for the review on how to improve those surveys. And so far, that's all the information that we have on that bill. But again, that they said that they would share it with us as soon as it was available. Before I move on to the working waterfronts bill, can I ask for any questions regarding those items?
Go ahead, Lynn.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just a quick question about the minibus. Was there any discussion, it might not be the right place, about the requirement for the USDA inspectors for catfish processors? I mean, that would be a great place, I would think, to do something about that.
There wasn't any discussion around it, but as we continue conversations with those offices, I'll certainly bring it up.
John?
Yeah, I was just curious, Alexander, how long has it been now since the MSA reauthorization talk has been going on? I mean, this is like, what, 5 or 6 Congresses that haven't gotten it done?
That sounds about right.
I don't see any other hands, Alexander, if you want to keep going.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to move on to the Working Waterfronts program. Working waterfronts face numerous pressures threatening their existence. This includes the effects of climate change, disasters, gentrification, redevelopment, and more. There have been 2 bills recently introduced that address these threatened working waterfronts, both introduced by members from Maine. Senator Collins introduced a bill that would establish a grant program to help municipal and state governments, nonprofit organizations, and participants in maritime industries to purchase or improve working waterfront property in coastal states. Representative Pingree, also from Maine, also introduced a working waterfront bill, which would establish a working waterfront task force within the Department of Commerce. The task force would be charged with evaluating many of the pressures that these working waterfronts face and identifying working waterfronts within communities that are important and worthwhile to save. Pingree's bill would also establish a working waterfronts grant program and a working waterfront preservation loan fund. The grant program would award matching grants to participants aimed at preserving and expanding access to coastal waters for a whole range of different participants, anything from commercial fishing to recreational fishing, aquaculture, boat building, and other coastal businesses. And the loan fund would make funds available to local governments for improvement projects. I've drafted a high-level letter of support. The legislative committee has recommended that we engage with these bills at a very high level, not directly supporting either bill necessarily because they have significant differences between the two, but commenting on the need for such a program. So I've drafted a high-level letter of support, which is included in the supplemental materials too. And two things I want to note is the scope of what the legislative committee wanted to address in this working waterfront program. They thought it was important to cover the commercial through the for-hire industry, going all the way down to the recreational industry with Representative Pingree's bill is something that they were concerned about. They thought that there could be a snowball effect in how the recreational industry could apply for these grants for working waterfronts, and they were concerned about the recreational industry being included. The other thing that they wanted included in the working waterfronts bill is covenants for the protection of these working waterfronts in perpetuity. The legislative committee was concerned that without protective covenants in place, these improved properties would face a higher conversion or gentrification pressure. So those are just 2 things to note that we were looking for from those bills. And that about wraps it up.
Great, thank you, Alexander. Any other questions on that last part of that? Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Alexander, for that report. I just quickly some kudos for Alexander. He's done a great job, kind of herding cats with the legislative committee, and it's really good to have that focus on that across all of the bills that we're dealing with. The working waterfront is something that has been a very active program in the state of Maine. We've put protective covenants on, I don't know, 20 or 30 properties now in Maine, and that protective covenant really is the backbone of the program. I do, though, want to also highlight the fact that I think we may see some changes in these legislations. A lot of people probably are not aware, but Maine just had back-to-back storms. It really wasn't covered more broadly in the national news, but we have hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage to our working waterfront that stretches the entire coast of Maine. I mean, it's really incredible what this damage is. So I think it highlights the fact that some protections with these working waterfronts, giving some available resources to these private businesses that are not covered under FEMA disasters, are not, and likely will not be covered under a fishery disaster if we don't meet a 35% threshold. So it's one of those things where it feels like from a commission standpoint, it's a little bit of mission creep, but on the other hand, it's the backbone of our fisheries and the programs that we have to support. So I would highly recommend that we do endorse the concept of protection of working waterfronts with that more of a generic letter. But I think the legislative committee is going to need to stay engaged, because I think we're going to see some changes around working waterfront and disaster declarations and how they're done, because the current federal law and the Magnuson and the other disaster declarations under IJ that have been taken away. So from a storm, we're from a climate change perspective, all of our states are facing a great threat. I'm certainly not a climate denier, but I never thought I'd see what I saw happen in Maine 2 weeks ago. It's really incredible. So thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. Thoughts are with you. I kind of was surprised that there wasn't more coverage for, hearing just from you on what Maine's been going through. So, Erica?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Alexander, thank you for those updates. I would like us to continue to stay updated, if you would, on those working waterfront bills, understanding that they're very different, and maybe possibly in the future, as things move along, the commission consider a second letter to the specifics of whatever bill we think might move.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Eric. And I was encouraged to hear that some of the legislators that have been in discussions with us have said that they're willing to share these bills, and that I think that's very helpful. We've been very fortunate that we've got a engaged legislative committee now that's been pretty active. So I think that'll help us, not only stay abreast, but continue to give the kind of important comments I think that we have been for the last few years. Any other comments or questions? Alexander, go ahead.
And we are reviewing membership of the legislative committee. So if you are interested in participating, talk to Bill Hyatt, Bob, or myself. Thank you.
Just to that end, the annual chair's memo comes out, or was being worked on right now by Joe and staff, that lists all the committees, the awards committee, the nominations committee, and all the other committees at the commission. So if any of you guys have interest in serving on those, or suggestions on populating those committees, let us know. I think we're getting pretty close to that document being done. But any willing participants are always welcome in any of those committees.
Thanks, Bob. Any other questions or comments? No. Okay, great. Thanks again, Alexander. And then our next item is another kind of committee that's kind of being repopulated, and we had a request from Bob to get some tasks or thoughts to Janita for the Committee on Economics and Social Sciences. I know that you haven't had much time to put that together. The deadline was pretty recently for us to get stuff in, and some of us do procrastinate, but we'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Chair. So the Committee on Economics and Social Sciences, after a few years of dormancy, has now reconvened. We have several new members and now have representation from each of the 15 states, as well as a new chair, Sabrina Lavelle from NOAA, and a new vice chair, Andrew Scheld from BIMS, both of whom are joining us online today. Since coming back together, the SES is interested in becoming more involved in commission projects to lend a socioeconomic perspective to management decisions. Because of this, they thought it would be best to see what upcoming tasks the board would like them to work on. So here we have a few focus areas that the SES could potentially work on. These include the economic impacts of year-round wreck fishing, standardizing social and economic indicators and management plans, and addressing individual state or fishery needs. And I'll go into a bit more detail for each of these. So for recreational fishing, we've seen increased effort throughout the calendar year, including effort in Wave 1 for northern states. This can be seen through a growing number of real-time social media phishing posts like the one seen on this slide. One potential area that the SAS could focus on if the Commission is interested is how increased effort in previously quiet waves could impact select species or regions. There's also the question of how increased efforts could impact the management of the fishery in the long term. So based on that, one potential task could be to determine whether wreck species are experiencing increased effort from year-round fishing and attempt to quantify the economic impacts of this by both species and by region. Aside from increased effort for wreck fishing, the SAS could also develop a standard set of socioeconomic indicators to provide a more comprehensive understanding of each fishery outside of just the biology. Some examples of these indicators include trends in prices, participant demographics, directed trips. There has been talk of interest in these types of data to help make more comprehensive management decisions. For example, there were several spots in the 2020 American Lobster Benchmark Stock Assessment that called for the use of similar indicators. So this is pulled straight from the benchmark assessment. It is a table of current fishery performance indicators that they had looked at, including the number of traps, stock landings, catch per unit effort, etc. Having something like this outside of stock assessments for each species or community of species by region may help us begin to incorporate socioeconomics into management. There was a couple of additional takeaways that came out of that lobster assessment, including the possibility of conducting economic analyses for post-assessment management decisions, and in the long term, the creation of economic reference points for each species. So with that, there are two potential tasks for the SAS when it comes to social and economic indicators. The first would be to develop a list of these indicators by species to help track economic and social impacts of management decisions. And the second is to conduct impact analyses for post-assessment management decisions on a case-by-case basis. That brings us to our last point and the most important part of the SAS, which is working on state projects and addressing state needs. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to any thoughts that the committee might have about potential state projects or any of the other potential SAS tasks outlined today.
Great, thank you. So floor is open as I mentioned. You know, Bob had put in this request for info, and you know, to me, this is kind of a first blush at how we're going to tackle this. It's going to be great to have this committee back together. We've got some folks that I know their history, and I'm excited to have them on this group. A lot of folks working on a bunch of different projects. Not surprisingly, a lot of offshore wind tie-ins in with this group as well. So, but open the floor up, Jay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I need to apologize to both Bob and Janita. I got the email, and then Janita actually asked me a second time, and I just didn't respond. And I'm super sorry. I spaced on it until Joe mentioned it to me this morning. So sorry. A couple of quick thoughts. I really like and nice job, you know, with what you presented, Janita. So I really like the idea of developing kind of a suite of indicators. It would be particularly helpful if those indicators, you know, if possible, could be connected into the risk policy framework. So the current risk policy framework has these kind of generic, you know, short-term, long-term socioeconomic impacts. And I think the reason we did that was to keep things kind of tractable in the short term. But the idea, I think, would be to get a little more refined with those over time and kind of evolve. And so I think indicators are one way that we can inform some of the qualitative scales that are being used in that part of the risk policy. For state needs, and I'll stick with indicators for now, it would be cool if those indicators could scale. So if you have like think about it like a Shiny app, and you could kind of, you know, you've got a suite of indicators, and you could click on your state and it would give you the output just for your state if it's possible to create the indicator in that way. So I would find that really valuable. You know exactly what indicators I'm talking about. I think you highlighted some good ones there, and I won't try and develop a list here, but all of that stuff is super important. I think most states don't have access to that in a nice user-friendly way like that, and it comes up all the time when we're trying to make the case for our marine fisheries programs and with our state legislatures and things like that. And then a final one from me is to start to think about some, I don't know, it may be too much to use the word create, but maybe at least review some socioeconomic models that exist or could exist that could be plugged into things like, I don't know, like management strategy evaluation. That might be one way you could use it. So I'm going to haunt you with that, Pat. Joking aside, I think if you can start to build tools that you can kind of plug in, that process becomes more efficient. So even if it's, again, I don't know that there are modelers on the CES per se, but there's some tools out there already. Joe mentioned the recreational demand model that's being used now with some of the jointly managed species and things like that. So just even getting like, hey, here's some ones that exist out there in the world that could be applied for various management needs. That's it. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. And I'll just, to that end, Jay said that I mentioned the recreation demand model. That was just between the two of us. I haven't said that on the record, but we are trying to use more complicated models, that are data hungry, to kind of help us understand what will be the impacts of the regulations we put in place. And so I agree with Jay for both our risk policy and for models like that, that if the CES could kind of have something on hand for those models, it would be extremely helpful. And then I saw Doug, and then, well, it's the only hand I saw so far. Go ahead, Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What's the long-term funding for this committee? What's the long-term funding for this committee? And if I come forward with some state needs, do I have to bring money with it, or are we looking for federal, or has the commission got some funds?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. It is, the commission does have funds for this group to get together and do what they do. We don't have a pool of money for them to fund projects or do, issue grants, that sort of thing. So it's really, I don't know, view it as a technical committee where we have funds to bring those folks together. They actually do the work themselves and then report out to the policy board or whatever groups want to, whatever are relevant to that project. So we do have money for them to get together, but we don't have money for them to hire folks or do contracts and that sort of thing, or collect data. If the committee wanted to do something where they're going to do a survey and they needed to go to 50 ports up and down the coast, we don't have funds to cover that yet. But if there is a project that they suggest that we want to do, and we can start working to find funds for that, we can gladly do that.
Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going a little bit the same direction as Doug. So, Janita, this is really exciting. This is the stuff that I think we sorely need. But my question is, and I'm particularly intrigued by the year-round recreational fishing and quiet waves. So my question is, how much data does the CES think it has on hand to tackle some of these topics? And how much data will need to be collected? And then as a state, what am I looking at in terms of planning to potentially help provide data that you guys might need to proceed with the analyses you want to do?
Yeah, so that is an excellent question. Unfortunately, I have not really looked into how much economic or social data is out there, just because I'm not a social scientist or an economist by trade. But we do have both of our new chairs, Sabrina and Andrew, on the webinar. If either of you want to give maybe a more comprehensive overview of what's available on a coast-wide basis, that would be great. Just give them a second. Okay, Andrew and Sabrina, both of you are unmuted, so go ahead to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Okay, this is Sabrina. Thank you for having us on the webinar. I was going to say, I think it highly depends on the species and the state, what's available. So I can't answer that question directly. I think we would have to look probably at the MRIP data for those different species that people would be interested. So I think in some cases there would be enough data. In other cases, if there are species that aren't caught a lot in that wave and it's sort of new, maybe not too much, but I really don't know without looking at individual species. Maybe Andrew has a better idea.
Yeah, just to add, I think MREP and then dealer reporting at the kind of coast-wide level, the federal sort of data collection requirements are sort of a nice base, and then it's going to be variable state to state. So I know kind of what I could get in Virginia, but I don't necessarily know what's available coast-wide or in other states. So that's probably actually a good point of discussion at our next meeting to put it out to state level members to go and kind of maybe compile lists of what they think types of socioeconomic data they could get at the state level would be. So because we really just don't have a comprehensive understanding of that at this point. Thanks.
John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Janita. I was just thinking along the lines of what Joe and Jay mentioned about the RDM, wondering if there's some similar application we could do for some of the commercial species, because yesterday, two of the boards we had, like with spiny dogfishes, we heard at council, and then here, we're facing a situation where the quotas will get so low that the one processor that remains might go out of business. How do we analyze situations like that when we're managing? And then eel was very interesting to hear the comments of Sarah Rademacher saying how she's producing eels in her aquaculture facility full out, and yet she's just a drop in the bucket compared to all the eels that are being imported, which in a lot of cases are glass eels that were shipped from the US to China and other Asian countries, grown out and then shipped back here for sushi and other things like that. So just curious as if that's something we could look at from an economic perspective. Could we, as we heard, there was pressure to reduce yellow eel harvest, and yet glass eel seem to be strong in a lot of places. Should we be trying to encourage more aquaculture of eels in these grow out facilities? It seems like a very strong business, and it'll be good to look at that from an economic perspective. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, John. Agreed. And Spud.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not on your committee, thankfully, but appreciate being recognized. If you'll indulge me, I think it might be interesting if I can query the states represented here. Raise your hand if you have a economist on staff at your agency. Okay. Raise your hand if you have a social scientist on staff at your agency. Okay, thank you.
Yes, but for those that, since there were just a few hands, North Carolina and New Jersey for the economists, but I want to make it clear, Spud, that when I raise my hand, it's because our Marine Resources Administration is part of the greater DEP, and there's a single economist for all of New Jersey DEP who happens to be on this committee and has a bit of a fishing background from the West, or fisheries economics background from the West Coast. So we're very fortunate. Any other hands? Go ahead, Dan.
One of the issues that keeps coming up in my world is economic multipliers, especially as it pertains to offshore wind. And the fishing industry is typically unhappy with the number, and the wind developers, I think, tend to come up with a number that they think is more suitable. To me, that's an area that would be ripe for examination. And I think, Jason, you had actually chased down a grant at one point to develop even port-specific economic multipliers. Was that successful?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Dan, this exact thing came up at the ACCSP Coordinating Council. So the answer is, yeah, we've got somebody working on that. The status of grants is opaque to me right now, but we've got somebody that's actively working on that and trying to find grants to sort of plug in to complete the work.
So in my experience, some seafood products have a very low economic multiplier. Something like a soft shell clam is not really processed. It's just delivered to typically a secondary buyer and sold. Whereas other things might have an enormous economic multiplier, given the number of times it's sold and also the amount of processing that goes into the product. To me, that would be a really ripe area to examine for the commission, and maybe even team up with the National Fisheries Service, because I think both entities have an interest in these questions.
Yeah, I'll just jump in again because I'm living that life, unfortunately. In the offshore wind world, states that have perhaps the most direct impact are expected to take on these negotiations, and oftentimes for that area that's closest to them, you're taking on that negotiation for all the states that are all the fishers that have harvested whatever state they landed in. So it's, New Jersey negotiating or Massachusetts negotiating for individuals that are up and down the coast. And so it's definitely going to be a state need for all of us to kind of help standardize that. That's something that there are 11 states that have been trying to work on a standardization for the compensation aspect of it, but unfortunately there's still, at this point in time, it's really up to each individual state to be doing. So any help there would be fantastic. And to Pat's point, Maine is far ahead of many states, excuse me, on the working waterfront issues, to the extent that some states really don't have an engagement there and can't lay out quickly enough if there are issues or federal funds available, who those individuals are and what those impacts to those communities are. So the sooner we can get ahead of that at a state level is going to be very important. Any other hands?
I think online we have Sabrina.
Okay, we'll let Sabrina go and then I'll go to you.
Yeah, thank you. I find all of this really interesting, and I just wanted to let you guys know that some of the stuff that we're planning here at the Office of Science and Technology and with the economists, social sciences around the country, we have a lot of IRA funds that are dealing with some of these exact things you guys are talking about, especially some of the seafood post-harvest demand models and things like that. So Janita, if you can just get the names of people who are speaking, so maybe we can touch base with those people again later and get more details, that would be great.
You got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sabrina. That's one I hadn't thought about, but I think a lot of states directors, sitting here are probably overwhelmed when maybe there's a top down asking how do you tackle the IRA funds, or what are your thoughts? And it's just like, when do we have time to think about that, right? So it's like any help there would be fantastic as well. Jamie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to comment on what Mr. Woodward said earlier about the economist. It was ironic we went into wind energy because we had to hire an economist because we didn't have one on staff. And it was very eye-opening to how much we were missing on the working waterfront side of it. So even though it's very costly, it's a very, very good idea to have an economist, especially when you're doing something like that, to see what you're missing.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of points. Lynn, to respond in addition to your question about year-round recreational fishing effort, Jeff reminded me that we've asked in the past for one sampling or for MRIP to increase sampling in the states, I think New Jersey to the north. And so that may be a renewed ask to see if NOAA can support that. Again, to collect data to see if there's more fishing effort in addition to the core MRIP sampling that's already taking place. And I think every 5 years they do a economic survey, and so there may be pieces in there that the SES could glean those data and summarize some take homes for you all. Switching gears, back to John's comment and some of the board discussions this week or last year, the Jonah crab assessment outcomes suggested that maybe tracking demand for Jonah crab and some competing species like snow crab or Canadian snow crab would be useful. And talking with the lobster and Jonah TC leadership yesterday, they certainly would like any help in developing economic metrics as the TC and the SAS work on the stock assessment. So maybe that's another task, if there's no objection, where the SAS could plug in. And finally, Spud, appreciate your question and raising of hands. It is important to recognize that this is, the SES is largely a group of folks from universities or not from your agencies. And so it's very much a volunteer effort and workload. That's not unique. The technical committees are like that. Everyone's here sort of on volunteer time. But any communication between you all and your SES representatives to that effect, that we have an obligation under the Atlantic Coastal Act and state contributions or federal agency contributions to contribute to the committee would be helpful as well. And we appreciate the new representatives. I know 4 or 5 states you've put new SES members on, including members from Rhode Island and Massachusetts that could help out potentially on this Jonah crab work. So that's all.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Those are all points well made, and I think that I'm not going to tell these very smart people how this goes, but I think to Lynn's question, I think if something like the RDM could be run, then there is a lot of good information for the indicators, especially on the recreational side. And in fact, it may be useful to kind of bring that group in to have that conversation with them on what they're using, because I think there'll be a strong tie into what we're looking for a lot of other species. Anyone else? Okay, we're doing pretty good on time here too. Thank you much, Janita. And we'll, I think I hope that we can, find time here to continue this, because I think that engagement is going to be important. Like I said, to me, this is just a first blush at how we proceed. So, and Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you for our next agenda item, and also if you had anything else you wanted to wrap up on this item.
Just wrap up on this one. I think, you got new energy, new talent, new motivated people to help out on economic and social science issues. I've got a soft spot in my heart for this committee. It's my first job at the commission. 100 years ago, I was a 20-hour-a-week intern staffing that committee. So, if there are things that group can do where you have more ideas that we can start bouncing off them, and they can sort of, come back to us with ideas on how to tackle things, or some of these economic and social science projects are huge. So how do you boil them down to just incremental progress, learn a little bit more, and weave that little bit more that we know and learn into our management system, I think is the right strategy. So let's keep having these conversations. And if there are things, Janita's here and up and running and doing a great job. I think we're at an interesting spot with this group that will, we can get some things done that we haven't been able to get done in a number of years. So stay in contact and reach out to any of us if you have ideas on how they can help. So with that, jumping into the next agenda item, the commission leadership election process. There's an updated document on the briefing materials, the initial briefing materials, titled Commission Leadership Election Process, dated December 7th of last year. As everyone knows, we had an election at the annual meeting. There were a couple questions on the regional rotation and other things, and I went ahead and sent out the documentation that we had on the election process and got some feedback on it. And there's track changes document here. Most of the changes are really trying to make it more clear on how our annual election process and requirement for an annual election syncs up with the tradition at the commission of having chairs and vice chairs serve 2-year terms. So it was they kind of seem weird. What if, you know, if the chair and vice chair serve 2 years, why are we doing these elections every year? Because we're required to. So hopefully the language that's in this document clarifies that. And then relative to the regional rotation of leadership, the document used to read that the idea of rotating between North, Mid-Atlantic, and South should be maintained where possible. Now we've changed it to rotation between North, Mid, and South should be encouraged where possible, sort of, you know, lessening the drive on that. And the idea is it's great to have regional rotation or regional changes, but let's get you guys, you know, feel free to elect the best person for that job, even if they're, you know, the vice chair and the chair are both out of the Mid or both out of the North or whatever it might be. So those are, I think, relatively minor changes. They don't really change the process. They just clarify annual elections, but tradition of 2-year terms, and then encouraging the regional rotation. So those are the changes, I think, relatively minor.
Thanks, Bob. Any comments on that? Yeah. And then since there are some changes, if folks have had a chance to look through that, are there any concerns with the changes otherwise we'll be looking for consent from the executive committee? Okay. I don't see any hands with concern, so I'll assume then that there's consent on that. Thank you. And I think it's back to you, Bob.
Yep. All right, the next agenda item is a little bit longer, but the Commission's 5-year strategic plan. We went over this briefly at the annual meeting during the business session, and I sent the document back out with staff suggested edits, and then I received a number of suggested edits from folks on this committee as well as other commissioners. You know, as a reminder, the Commission has a 5-year strategic plan, and our current one expired at the end of the last calendar year, so we're working on our 24 to 28 new strategic plan. There's a general agreement at the annual meeting that there wasn't a need for an overall rewrite of this document. It's kind of a minor course corrections and clarifications, and just sort of, you know, updating this document to make it more contemporary and more reflecting how the Commission operates and the driving forces and other things at the Commission. So I don't think I'll go through all the track changes unless everyone wants me to, but, you know, there are a number of track changes throughout this document. You know, in the beginning, we're noting the importance of fishery dependent, fishery independent data collection and management, which was not recognized in this document before, but obviously ACCSP and other things that the Commission does, you know, that's an important part of what we do. You know, the notion that of balancing competing needs and stability and predictability in fisheries management is highlighted at the end of page 1 in the introduction as well. And then as you carry on, we're not suggesting changes to the mission or the vision at the Commission. We do highlight our partnerships are important with NOAA Fisheries, Fish and Wildlife Service, and we're adding USGS to a number of places in the document. Our relationship with USGS has emerged over the last 5 years during the span of the last strategic plan. So now we're recognizing that and all the contributions that USGS is providing to our scientific endeavors at the Commission. Under values, which is the top of page 3, we had a number of comments and suggestions and different ways of recognizing kind of who we're servicing here. Who all the work that's done by the Commission, who does that benefit? And we came down to, I think, a very simple, maybe Erica suggested this, a very simple, all-encompassing term of benefiting all fisheries participants. So rather than try to describe commercial, rec, for hire, all these other pieces, just everybody involved in fisheries, that's who we're trying to benefit with all the activities that happen at the Commission. Down in driving forces, this one, the major changes here really are, in the past, we called it changing ocean conditions, but we're more directly just saying, this is climate change. We're dealing with climate change. And it used to be a little bit, you know, we're trying to be a little bit more maybe benign or politically correct the last go around. But the reality is everyone knows that there's climate changes that are happening and we are reacting to them as fast as we can, and we're struggling to keep up. So, you know, this document recognizes that and the impacts on water quality and prey and habitat availability and disease and migration patterns and productivity and everything else that we deal with here. And then it highlights a few species that you all are working on, trying to figure out, you know, how to react to the quick changes that are happening in shrimp and lobster and cobia and a long list there. on the bottom of page 3. We've got middle of page 4, we talk about, we've added a paragraph there that talks about the governance and climate change. And again, adapting to what we're dealing with. So, again, just stating more directly, this is a climate change problem, and we're trying to relate to that. And then it talks about allocation, which is relatively unchanged. Ecosystem management, we recognize some of the work that's done in menhaden and horseshoe crabs. Offshore wind is highlighted in competing ocean uses, as everyone knows, for better or for worse. Talk about collaboration and cooperation among the states between our partners. We do highlight in this section that there's a recent trend that fundamental data collection and assessment support are dropping in the face of static or even decreasing funding at the federal level. So, that's a big issue. We've talked about it a lot, the notion that federal surveys are diminishing, federal biological sampling in the Northeast, and there's some concerns about menhaden sampling here in the Mid-Atlantic, maybe curtailed as well. So we want to highlight that in our strategic plan. And then we get into the goals and objectives on beginning on page 7. They're overall the same topics that they've always been: fisheries management, fisheries science, data collection, congressional outreach, our outreach, habitat, law enforcement, and the financial and administration of the commission. So those overall goals remain unchanged. There is some tweaking of language under goal 1 about changing ocean conditions and climate and fish habitat and again, climate change impact. So those are highlighted there. There's a bullet on the top of page 8 that is to promote sustainable harvest of and access to rebuilt fisheries. And Joe provided a comment on that. I believe it was you, Joe, that said, one of the things that is difficult. Well, the commission doesn't do a whole lot of promotion of access to fisheries or promoting fisheries participation. But one of the difficult things that the commission really works on is, as stocks are rebuilding, how sort of that metered access to that improved stock. And if stocks rebuild, if we've seen it before, if you give a little bit of access and the fisheries are really good, sometimes a whole lot of effort on the commercial or recreational side really piles onto that fishery, that we can dilute the progress that we're making, or even turn it around and set us back. So do we want to reword that bullet to do something different? And we can come back to that if you want, Joe, at the end. Goal 2 is science. Just again, wording changes here, but the idea of robust, actionable information to inform management decisions. And in this one, the second to last bullet on the bottom of page 8, balance requests from fishery management to finite assessment workload capacity. Again, this is the idea that another discussion point potentially is that ASMFC controls our own destiny sort of for some of our assessment resources. In other words, this group can charge the technical committees with getting stock assessments done and stock assessment subcommittees. However, we also rely on federal processes for all of our jointly managed species, summer flounder, scott, black sea bass, and others. The federal government helps out with a lot with menhaden, and they serve on striped bass technical committees and a number of other places, but we don't quite have as much control over that since they are federal processes. So do we want to put something in here that sort of splits that into 2 categories? One is what we have control over through our technical committees, state employees, and then the other is the federal processes through the Northeast Fisheries Science Center and the CDAR process in the South, and split those out. So that's another point we can come back to and talk about a little bit. Fisheries statistics is goal 3. That one's just clarified a little bit more. Generally, the overall goal there is not changed. It's to continue to collect and warehouse data through ACCSP, as we have been doing. Goal 4, fisheries habitat work, relatively unchanged. Goal 5 is compliance and law enforcement, relatively unchanged. Strengthen stakeholder support for the commission. This is our outreach work. And then legislative work just highlights some of the new sort of emerging issues that we're dealing with on Capitol Hill. But overall, still the same goal of making sure Capitol Hill is aware of our appropriations priorities as well as other priorities through the legislative process that's occurring. And then goal 8 is another discussion point. Should we leave goal 8 in here or take it out or keep it in here but not include it in annual action plans? And the idea for that is that the efficient and stable management of ASMSC financial and administrative activities is not really optional. We got to do it. We get grants, we're audited, we get required grant reports, all the other things that we have to do to keep the money coming in and going out at the commission. They're not optional. We have to meet all the requirements of the federal grant process. So it's up to the group. Do you want to keep goal 8 in here, or do you want to do something a little bit different? So that's a quick highlight or overview of the changes that are suggested here. Happy to answer any questions. Again, there's 2, maybe 3 points of conversation, Joe, and I can go over those if folks would like.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I haven't been sitting up here long enough, I don't think, to feel a bias towards how great this strategic plan looks, but I think as Bob mentioned, we thought there were tweaks needed. As a group, we kind of had that discussion that this does not need a major overhaul, but sitting up here now, I really value where this strategic plan is so far. We have a couple questions that if folks want to weigh in on, I'm interested in. As Bob pointed out, though, goal 8, I would really like to hear comments from people on whether or not where we think that belongs and how we handle that part of the strategic plan. I'll just say about personally looking at this, especially the parts that are involved with climate change, we're getting hit with some individuals out in the public that have a bone to pick with some certain element of fisheries. And I think they're coming to us with such a strong bias that it goes to, they have this quixotic solution and that's that one and only thing. And we don't have that luxury. I say all the time, even since I was vice chair and meeting with Spud and Bob, that right, but if climate change was real, what would we expect to see? And unfortunately, we already have a list of species where that's been happening, right, with winter flounder, northern shrimp, weakfish. And I think that we're seeing that with striped bass and menhaden. And so, I think that is something that as part of our guidance here, we need to give a lot of consideration to. I think the document covers it, but I would like to hear others' thoughts on that as well. So I'm going to start with Dan and then we'll go to Jay.
So Bob, you were looking for comments on goal 1, and there was a question about the term promote sustainable harvest of and access to rebuilt fisheries. I'm pretty comfortable with that as written for a couple of reasons. Clearly the commission, while it doesn't force a state to alter its licensing schemes, which I think is most of what a lot of our states do at home, and we have such great differences in limited entry or IFQs, but we do make sure that as fish get redistributed, those stocks are available to certain states. The one that comes to mind is Maine with the menhaden fishery. Clearly, Maine didn't have access to much menhaden, but after the 2 addendums, that changed because that's where the fish were. And even as something like black sea bass might be redistributing, I can imagine a conversation at this table about allowing some nominal bycatch levels in states or regions that are seeing fish that haven't been, and the states themselves can go back and make sure that the public has access to that fish. And of course, on the seafood side, when stocks get redistributed or they increase, more of the public can enjoy that seafood. So, fishery is a very encompassing term that we misuse or use to our advantage. So to the extent that we do redistribute quota and that to the extent that the public gets access to seafood, I think it's okay as written.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try and tick through these quick. So I agree with Dan on the rebuilt language. I like the way that is. I kind of interpret it in the way that that you mentioned, Dan. Just a typo-y one. There's like a weird transition from numbered page 1 to numbered page 2. So check that out. Just thought I'd help there. And then this one, you're going to think I'm being like snarky. And I had this thought before yesterday, I swear. But goal 2 is like an MSE. Everything that's in there is. So I just wonder if we should mention that explicitly in there at some point. But like all of the elements are like the elements of a management strategy evaluation. The point of which is to kind of collect that, the stakeholder feedback, but the idea is to use more robust information for making management decisions. So I just thought I'd mention that. There's a section in there, and I'm sorry, I tried to pull it up here again, and I can't quite put my cursor on it, but there's a section, and Joe, you mentioned this in your lead-in to these comments, but there's a section on reprogramming resources. So, I think the idea was something like northern shrimp, these stocks that the idea was when it looks like there are drivers outside of fishing and they're persistent, we should try to do something, but if it doesn't seem like our management is successful, we should pivot and devote our resources elsewhere, which I agree with all of that. But I wondered if we could be a little more directed there and suggest something to the effect of like developing criteria for when we kind of make that call. So I just thought having something like more actionable there might help. And then finally, to actually answer one question that you actually wanted feedback on, goal 8, I would be fine with removing. That's the kind of like it's good, stuff, but I've never seen that type of thing in a strategic plan, like at the state level or anything like that. So I think it could be removed. Thanks.
Thanks, Jay. I might ping you and maybe others as well, because, we were doing this climate resiliency work, and when you're talking about criteria, do you think it's specific enough to climate change that like that group may hit on what kind of criteria? And obviously, National Marine Fisheries Service is kind of looking at this, and we're seeing legislation to talk about when do things change for which council's managing and stuff like that. Or do you think that the commission really should probably have a separate set of criteria specifically to when we make a decision on to pivot?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So I think, right, I guess I was kind of thinking of like the northern shrimp case. So that, that's one where there's not going to be guidance from anywhere else. So we have to kind of come up with it on our own, although we could borrow from these other initiatives that are going on if some of those things are relevant. So they're kind of like, I think there are probably some overarching ones that would be applicable across species and situations, but that's, I guess, the idea, the strategic action there would be to think on this a little bit and kind of come up with that plan.
Yeah, thank you. Duly noted. And I don't know if others noticed this during lobster Jonah crab, but it looked to me like Canada really made that decision very quickly. They kind of like, as far as monitoring and assessment work, as soon as that fishery collapsed, it looked like they just kind of moved on. So I thought about northern shrimp and how long we held on compared to that. And it was very stark to me. I apologize. I know there were a bunch of hands, but I saw Pat first, so I'll go to Pat next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I talk about goal 1, I just want to make sure it's clear on the record that I fully support adding management strategy evaluation in the document. Still feeling bad about yesterday's lobster meeting. and I didn't even have to buy Jay dinner last night. The climate, adding climate more specifically in goal 1 is something I support. I think it's necessary. And just to give you a very quick example, Maine has a climate council, very large, focused across a great breadth of different areas. But the Marine Working Group has been talking a lot about climate resilient fisheries and the fact that they want to try to start managing for fish that are now showing up in Maine waters without the understanding of the management structures, the commission process, the council process, the quotas associated with them. So we're actually presenting to them to give them a better understanding of that in the coming weeks. But I think being able to point to a goal that explicitly calls out being taking climate concerns into consideration as part of our management strategies is going to be, and even management strategies evaluations are critically important. So thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Erica?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the thoughtful work that staff put into editing this document and the contributions from commissioners. I agree that it doesn't need, wholesale change, and I think the changes that were presented are appropriate. I suggested a change to the value statement back in.
Erica, I'm sorry, if you can get a little closer, it's hard to hear up here. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try again. I start off with a lot of thanks and appreciation to everyone. I think overall the document is good. It doesn't need that wholesale change, and I appreciate the thoughtful comments that staff, the thoughtful changes that staff made and commissioners contributed. I had a change to the value statement that I requested back in the fall. I brought a suggestion to Bob after hearing the feedback from other commissioners, so I hope that everyone is okay with those changes. I appreciate the comments that are in here for consideration. I think they're thoughtful for those 2 points that are included in the comment blurbs, but I think that the language is appropriate. I understand why they're raised, but I think it's fine. As far as goal 8, I always like to include the whole cumulative work and body of a staff and an organization in documents to recognize the importance of the administrative and financial support and the role that those staffs provide in order to enable us to reach our larger goals. But as far as a strategic planning document, I don't feel strongly either way whether it stays in or not.
Okay, thank you. Roy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I looked through this document for a subject that interests me, and I didn't see it specified. And that is, if we look at goal 3, and perhaps even part of goal 2, this business of the erosion of public trust in the MRIP data because of recent concerns about the need for recalculation, possible biases in the survey. I'm worried that it has further eroded public trust, which in my view was shaky to begin with regard to the use of MRIP statistics in fisheries management. And maybe we need to highlight that effort a little more. It seems to me that NOAA Fisheries is basically driving the bus on the recalculation of that issue. Perhaps the commission should play a more active role in that as well. Just my opinion in that. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. It's noted. I'm not particularly sure how and where we go with that. I know it was tough to hear that, but I really appreciate Noah's openness on that. I know for a lot of people, it seemed like there was still some behind the curtain stuff there, but I think they were as open and as quickly as they could be. And I personally have a lot of experience working with the MRIP staff, and they have a very difficult job. As far as legislation on making that better, I think we all know that survey work is always going to be survey work, but a lot more money could have helped, and Tom Foty's been telling us that for 30 years, right? but yeah, it's something for us to consider. And Bob, I think, even if it's not as much about our role in helping, to ensure that as the process moves forward, that they're constantly communicating with us and providing them time to do that is something that we certainly can do. So I saw John and then Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just be brief. I think goal 8 should stay in there just because it's really hard to explain fisheries management to the public. I recently was asked to talk to a high school class that was to tell them about fisheries management. And when I start going into what we manage on the state level, what we manage through ASMFC, what we manage through the commission jointly, highly migratory species that the state manages with NOAA fisheries, the eyes glaze over. But I think somebody from the public that doesn't really know anything about the commission, if they come to the website, maybe one of the first things they'd look at is this plan. I mean, in full confession, I don't look at it very often except when we're renewing it every 5 years or whatever. And I think it's good to let them know that keeping the commission running on a sound financial basis, it's a short goal there. I don't see any need to take it out. Thanks.
Lynn, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to go first, to just echo everything Erica said, thank you for the work on the document. I love this. It's just such a valuable piece of work, and it takes a lot of thought to put this together as you have. Goal 8, I don't have particular strong feelings, but I actually do think it benefits the document to be in there. But I wanted to talk a little bit about goal 7 or goal 6, which is to strengthen stakeholder and public support for the commission, which has a lot of actions around increasing public understanding and support. And Joe brought this up earlier with our passionate constituents. Bob and I have talked about this. I almost feel like there needs to be some sort of particular action that talks more about proactive communication around complex issues and public concern. We had a meeting about this internally at our agency, and one of our communications experts said, when you're in a situation, and Menhaden is an example we're all aware of, you want to acknowledge the complexity and you want to go on the offense. And I think one of the things we maybe could do better is take a more of a proactive and offensive stance on the facts. I think we tend to be a little bit too polite, and we get behind the bus. So I don't know, the language I had jotted down was develop proactive communication strategies around complex issues that directly address public concerns. That's sort of a loaded statement. It requires resources, but I just wanted to take that out there, that I think sort of all of the happy words like communicate, engage, those are all well and good, but I think we're at a place with things like horseshoe crab and Menhaden and other species are coming where we need to figure out a way to get ahead of the train and address some of these, really hit the facts hard for people. So thanks.
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, I hate to say this, but it's true. I stay up at night. I really do. From about 2 to 5. It's and staff here is absolutely incredible. From Bob and Tony, getting the information back and forth with staff on any questions we have. Could we do that? And Tina's like a warrior, she's ready to go at all times. So could we do that? Absolutely. The balance, and we've talked about this, I think about John and I were the 2 most recent chairs of horseshoe crab, and that's a perfect example of dealing with that balance. But I fully agree. We have to, because I think what we see happening is if it isn't addressed, there's a snowball effect, right? and individuals and legislators start getting concerns that might not even make sense, but they don't necessarily automatically engage. Good.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to follow up to be clear on the record that I was in no way intending, to be critical of commission staff or our actions. I think, because the staff, it's a heroic effort that goes forth every day. I want to be clear about that, but I also think, we are scientists and rational managers, and we're living more and more in a little bit of an irrational world. So I think we need to sort of maybe rethink our rational thought. We don't need to become irrational, but I think we just need to be maybe a little faster off the blocks in some of this stuff.
Sheree?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This took a lot of work in revising, and I appreciate it, and I think it went well with the revisions. I just have a couple questions. On page 2, the top of page 2, you're talking about efficiencies, working with the 3 regional councils and NOAA fisheries. I was just wondering why U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wasn't involved in that particular lead-in sentence, because of course they're the ones that have the authority for American eel as the federal agency. I noticed that you guys covered it later on, but this was just a lead-in sentence. I was just wondering if that was something that could be added or intentional.
Not intentional, we can add that and probably add USGS there as well.
Thanks. And also throughout the document, there was a lot of discussion, of course, on offshore wind. And I noticed at some points there was renewable energy was replaced with offshore wind. I think that renewable energy might be more efficient, because we're not going to be just dealing with offshore wind in our future. There's going to be other, tidal and such renewable energy projects. And I was just wondering, I can understand if it's in this 5-year plan. However, I think if we're talking about energy in general, that we should just kind of make it more blanket as opposed to just continue with the offshore wind. I know it's what we're dealing with right now, but I also know that we're in New Hampshire starting to deal with tidal requests and such. So I'm just trying to make things more comprehensive through this. Thanks. Those are just my suggestions.
No, that's very good. I think, yeah, to some extent that may just play into, like you said, what we're dealing with. And so it becomes a little bit of a bias, but you can't overlook that some of the states are going to start dealing with, legislation and proposals for other types of renewables that are going to be impacting us. So that's very good. Thanks. Other hands? Okay. So I will ask the 2 of you then on item 8 or goal 8. Do we think we have enough feedback to go one way or the other? Okay. All right. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, leaving it in there doesn't hurt anything, obviously. It doesn't take anything away from the document. And as folks have said, maybe it adds something. But I think maybe the step that we take is, or each year we put together the annual action plan, as everyone here knows. Maybe we leave some of that detail out of the annual action plan, because like for Laura to say she's going to do grant reports and all these things that are mechanical and required, maybe we just don't need to put that big laundry list in the action plan, but we have it in the strategic plan. And if there's anything new and different, whatever, a new software package for accounting or something like that, we could put that in the annual action plan. But if it's sort of the not just, but just care and feeding, we don't have to put all those details into the action plan each year.
Okay, well, thank you then to everybody for feedback on that. And as Bob was just pointing out to me, we'll take this up in business session for approval. And with that, apologies, folks, I moved myself off our agenda. So it's back to Bob for a discussion. And for anyone that had a concern with this being on the agenda, I kind of asked only to kind of bring it back because there were discussions when we were virtual on, you know, the future of whether or not we consider doing that. For those that don't know, the Mid-Atlantic has made a decision to go virtual, at least for one meeting in 2025. And there may be intent to keep that going. So I thought it should be brought up because we had discussions on this a while back and we haven't talked about it since. So go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, thanks. I don't have a lot to add. You know, obviously during COVID, we were virtual the whole time. And then when Spud became chair, he brought us all back together because Pat didn't want to. No, I'm just kidding. Pat shepherded us through a lot of tough times. You know, so for the last 2+ years, we have been back face to face for 4 meetings a year, which is great. But during that time period, there have been some off and on discussions whether do we want to get together 4 times a year? Should we get together 4 times a year? Is that, you know, or do we want to do what the MID has recently done and make 1 meeting per year virtual or not? You know, it's really up to this group. There's obviously value in face-to-face interaction, especially the offline interactions. But there's expenses and wear and tear on all of you associated with that as well. So it's, you know, it's just an open-ended conversation at this point to see if we want to consider changing format of any meetings in the future. You know, Laura's shop makes these plans pretty far in advance. So if we want to change anything for 2025, we need to do that now virtually or essentially. So, you know, we've got all the meetings or all the hotels for the remaining 3 meetings this year are booked and set. 2 more here, 1 more in Annapolis, which Lynn will talk about. But again, if you want to do something for any of the meetings in 25, we need to decide sooner rather than later. Not necessarily today, but pretty soon.
Go ahead, Dan.
Since each of us has an opportunity to participate virtually, and I will say that the virtual execution of the meetings is outstanding. I guess one question I have is, are we getting enough people here in the hotel to satisfy the hotel contract? But you can answer that later. But the thing about today's striped bass meeting, I'm really glad it's in person because it's going to be controversial and it's going to be so important to have those sidebar conversations and caucusing. And caucusing just doesn't work. It's hard enough, you know, if you're just trying to communicate through texting to your 2 other virtual members of your delegation, but it's so important to be able to talk to other delegations. And if we did go virtual, that would mean that this February meeting might become, or the winter meeting might become the meeting that nothing happens controversial. And so I'm in favor of keeping it in person.
Thanks, Dan. Any others? Dennis?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I echo what Dan just said. There are advantages to the virtual meetings. I mean, personally, my hearing isn't good, and I sit here at a lot of meetings and you people don't have your microphones close enough for me to hear clearly. But when we're doing a virtual meeting, I hear very well and I can pay more attention. Contrary, a lot of times when someone wants to speak virtually, the chair recognizes them and it takes, you know, a moment or 2. Who is this person? Do I recognize who they are? Are they a new person or what? So it makes a difference when someone speaks down at the end of the table. I kind of always want to look and see who's talking. So we have that. And I think it's very important to meet face to face. And I think that sometimes, you know, we've talked about shortening meetings. I think in recent years, we've been, I won't say delinquent or whatever, but in earlier years, we used to have more time spent on training, whether it's stock assessments or parliamentary procedure. There was usually some time set aside during the meeting week to do that. Also, during the meeting weeks, you know, with the shortened meetings, we're being asked to go to Capitol Hill, or suggested that we go to Capitol Hill. But when we're here, for instance, this week, I don't see that there's been any time available for people to step away and spend, X amount of hours going up on the Hill to meet with the congressmen or their staff. So I like, in some part, the virtual meetings. It does afford the opportunity for those who may not be able to be here specifically, but the value of in-person meetings are very important, regarding subject matter and also interpersonal relationships that are developed here as we work together.
Pat and then Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly prefer the in-person format for many different reasons. I think Dan certainly touched on a lot of them. The hybrid component, though, of those, I just want to make sure we're clear. Right? We're still talking about allowing some level of hybrid access, which I think is important. Gives us a little bit of flexibility. The last meeting I had to leave to be back for some meetings, but I was still able to participate the following day virtually. So gave me the benefit of not missing some important discussions. So I think as we go forward, we need to continue to stress that these are in-person meetings, but understanding that there is that hybrid component. So it seems to be working.
Thanks, Pat. Chris and then Marty.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, agree with everyone else's comments. I was originally a proponent of having the winter meeting as virtual, with just the challenges we have with traveling during the winter time. But I think this meeting's agenda shows that having the current format is best with striped bass on the agenda. At ASMFC, it's hard to predict, what's going to show up during which quarterly meeting as far as topics. For the Mid-Atlantic Council, where they're looking at having a virtual meeting in February, there's more of a consistent pattern as far as what's going to appear on the agenda for their meetings as opposed to ASMFC. And then just the previous comments of support for the virtual option, that kind of hybrid option we have for these in-person meetings is great. I think we all take advantage of it where we have competing work schedules and other things going on. So I think as long as we have that in place, the way we're doing it, we're fine the way we are. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So I won't repeat whatever I heard, but concur with Dan, Pat, Chris. In person is the preference. For our delegation, we just have the administrative representative here. So it's a challenge. It's been a challenge just for us to communicate over text. It's a preference for us to be in here in person, and certainly agree that the caucus is related to like what this afternoon's striped bass discussion is going to be really important and need to happen in person. But then again, we still have the flexibility for the folks like they're on our delegation. They have real reasons why they're not here. They would certainly be here if they could, but the system seems to be working really well. And again, I'd be in favor of keeping it in person. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. I'll go to Justin and then John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just echo what a lot of folks around the table have said. I feel like we've settled into a really good new normal here with the way we're doing the meetings. I can't see going to a full virtual meeting and just sort of hampering our ability to get business done, something that was a problem periodically during COVID. And I also can't see going to requiring in-person attendance and doing away with the hybrid component. It would just take away that flexibility that I think is really important. So I think, it's not broke, don't fix it. It's kind of where I'm at.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm fine with the current format. I was just curious, for Delaware, this is only a 2-hour drive, so it's no big deal. But if the meeting had been last week, for example, we did have there still is winter weather around. And if there was a meeting that was going to be virtual, I would say it would be the winter meeting. And perhaps we could Hey, it was real snow down here, okay, 5 inches. It's the equivalent of what, 3 feet up your way, okay, so. But I would just wanted to ask Laura, with the hotel arrangements, is there any advantage, is there savings to ASMFC if we only did 2 meetings a year in the hotel rather than 3, or do you have to pay like a fixed rate and your rate would go up the less you use the place?
It's always better negotiating to have more meetings, yes. So I don't think it would be a negative either way, because I think we get the very best deal we can get at this hotel in the area. They treat us really well. Repeat business is what hotels live for. So.
Thanks. Yeah, because I'm just thinking in terms of, we know budgets are going to be tighter. Is there savings that could be seen from, especially maybe not every year, but some years having a virtual meeting and just using the savings and the travel and the hotel for other purposes?
John, I mean, I think the sense I'm getting here is that things are going quite well, and it's a discussion that can be brought up again in the near future. But I appreciate all the comments so far. I don't want to cut anyone off if there are others. We'll be moving to closed session soon. Go ahead, Dennis.
Second bite at the apple, there's always pros and cons. I haven't stayed in a hotel that I haven't been able to find some fault with. And I can also find plenty to like about a hotel, whether the restaurants are closed, blah, blah, blah. If the shower, there's no hot water in the showers in the morning, huh, Pat?
That's correct.
Yeah. But, I mean, in favor of virtual meetings, I don't know how many times I've sat in or stood in a security line, how many times I've been waiting for an airplane to fly, getting to and from the airport in a snowstorm and so on. I mean, I've sat there and said, why am I doing this? It really doesn't make a lot of sense in my case, but it still goes back to the best way of conducting our business is to meet not virtually, but in person. And suggesting, on the one hand, that we meet a couple times a year, it's very possible that in the other times that we schedule a full virtual meeting, that there's important issues that we really should be sitting around the table, as Dan said, that, the issues are important enough that we need to work together at the table and away from the table to get through all the issues.
Yeah, thanks. You might not realize how excruciating it was for me. For 2 years, I would make jokes and have no idea if I got a single laugh, and it was you start to wonder, why am I doing this? Don't even say it. No, but one other thing that wasn't mentioned was, we're completely unique in this country, that we're dealing with states from Maine to Florida, and to have that ability for folks from Maine and Florida to provide public comment without traveling to DC, I think is incredible. I think it's fantastic. I would never want to see that go away. And kudos to staff for making it, such a success story. And also kudos, I'm on the to the Mid-Atlantic staff for having it, I think, a very successful hybrid meeting. Oh, and we have Eric virtually. So go ahead, Eric.
Okay, there you go. So I guess I should, just for fun, I should say, can you hear me now, Joe?
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a perfect example of a lot of things. I'm sitting at my desk in Rhode Island right now, and I have a really good delegation, and we text back and forth a lot, but I don't get the advantage of talking to all of you in person, whether you like it or not. I think the hybrid meeting is necessary, and to Dennis Abbott's point, Pat Kelleher is the perfect example of how not to fly anywhere ever, because he never gets anywhere in one piece. But, what I'm doing right now is I'm thinking to myself, what am I doing here instead of being with you all in person? But unfortunately, I couldn't make it. So the hybrid format, I think, is really important. It's really on the commissioners to get their butts down to that meeting when they feel it's important. you know, and as it turns out, I mean, this, you know, I looked at this agenda and it's lobsters and striped bass. It's like, oh, it's only lobsters and striped bass. That's it. But, you know, the eel conversation yesterday was pretty extensive, and it always turns out that something you think is going to go really easily gets twisted around the axle in a big hurry, and it's really important to be in person. And I feel at a disadvantage because I'm not in person today. And the perfect example, Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me, was I had my hand up to comment under Mr. Law's presentation, but I didn't get a chance to speak. So would it be okay if I just took 2 seconds to talk about that?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's probably more like 15 seconds, but you know, I just really want to thank, you know, Mr. Beal and especially Mr. Law, who I don't think is in the room right now because he's on his way up to the Hill with the Virginia delegation for one of the 15 different meetings he has for commissioners to engage with congressional staff, which, I mean, that's impressive in itself. But, you know, you go into a meeting with the congressional staffers, and Bob and Alexander know more about what's going on the Hill than they do. It's really helpful, and it's really impressive that they have that knowledge. And, you know, particularly for me, I just want to thank both of them for, you know, dragging my butt up the hill and helping me navigate the process, whether they like it or not. So really appreciate it. And thanks for everything. So thank you, Joe.
Oh, thank you, Eric. I appreciate that, and absolutely I agree with you there. With that, we're going to start other business. We have a couple items that hopefully we can move through quickly in this open session, and then we will be moving to closed session to cover a few items. And so with that, Erica, if you're ready, if you wouldn't mind getting us started on that discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to raise this. Unfortunately, fisheries disasters are never something that anyone wants to experience, and there seem to be two kinds. They're the ones that are put in place by a resource failure, a resource collapse, and there are ones put in place by weather and storms attacking your infrastructure and your ability to participate in the fishery. And Florida's experienced that multiple times over the last decade, and unfortunately Maine has experienced that most recently. And we've seen that from administration to administration, the way that they handle fisheries disaster requests varies. We're so excited to recently have Congress pass the Fishery Resources Disaster and Improvement Act. We see that as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to improve the federal fishery disaster request process, to provide transparency and allow the law to address the differences between that resource collapse and something that is caused by a severe weather event. That law included language that said the geographical boundaries of the fishery as determined by the eligible requester, including the geographic boundaries that are smaller than the area represented by the eligible requester, could be put forward for a fishery disaster request. And though NOAA has not implemented regulations to implement the law itself, they have begun responding to fishery disaster requests related to this specific topic. And as is the case of Florida, when a hurricane hits us, it's thankfully unlikely that it impacts the entire state or either coast uniformly. We had that with Hurricane Idalia, we had it with Hurricane Irma, and we put forward a request to NOAA to consider a disaster for the geographic scope that was impacted in a fishery. We thought this was in line with the congressional intent. We've confirmed by the drafters of the legislation and their staffs and the members of Congress who passed the law that that was their intent. However, NOAA Fisheries is interpreting it differently. We've received feedback that for fisheries that have a federal management component, NIMS will use the fishery as described in the relevant fishery management plan to assess whether you meet the thresholds for a disaster. So in the case of Florida, when our Southwest Florida shrimp fleet was completely taken out, ships were sent miles inland, had to be recovered at a cost of $1 million a piece by crane, lifted out of the mangroves. NOAA said that they would not consider the disaster to be restricted to that area, that potentially we'd have to consider for the shrimp fishery, which is managed at the Gulf-wide scale, whether there was a 35% or greater loss along the Gulf Coast entirely. We're requesting that it be at least considered for the Gulf Coast of Florida and narrowing that scope. But as you can see, implementing congressional intent versus how NOAA is interpreting it could have real ramifications for your state like it's having for Florida. We've received additional guidance that establishing a management zone or sub-region of a fishery post-disaster will not be something that NOAA will entertain, which we think is directly contrary to the exact language in the law. So rather than wait until it impacts each one of us individually, we'd like to see, Florida would like to see whether there be interest in the commission writing a letter to NOAA Fisheries, encouraging them to implement regulations related to this law or implementing this law that would meet the congressional intent, that would allow states and management bodies to address disasters on the scale which makes sense to those who are impacted by the disasters. And happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. I think this is something that, you really brought down to the state level. So it's good to have this discussion. And I see Pat has his hand up. Go ahead, Pat.
Yeah, Eric and her staff, including their director, made themselves available to Maine to work through a conversation around disaster. And this was the first time I heard this regional component brought up. And as we were looking at what we face in Maine, if you look back at what we just did with herring, right? I mean, it was regional wide, right, from where the fishery takes place. However, here, if it's specific to lobster, and this is a hypothetical situation, right? But if it's specific to lobster, New Hampshire and Mass weren't impacted, and Maine was, that the way they've defined it becomes potentially very problematic. And the reason I'm highlighting that is even along the coast of Maine, the impact is to the lobster fishery right now, but the impact is lost access, which could translate to an individual's lost revenue to meet that 35% threshold. But that lost access is not coast-wide, right? York and Cumberland counties to the western Maine. I know you guys think it runs north and south, but it runs east and west. To western Maine they were impacted and they had a lot of damage, but that access wasn't lost. So as we focus on the impact from this recent storm, it's going to be kind of a county perspective along our coast, but not all counties. So I think that it kind of plays into this conversation that Erica is bringing up. And if there was congressional intent for the states to be able to determine or review the disaster based on how they believe the region breaks out, I think that's incredibly important. And we need to be on record with Congress asking them to clarify their intent to the agency so we have an understanding of how we need to be moving forward. And as I said earlier, right, it's Florida, it's Maine, but it's been New York, it's been New Jersey, right? I mean, these storms are more prolific, more common, and more intense, and we're going to be dealing with this in the face of climate change more and more every year. So I think we need to take a very active role, and I think this is really a good first step to try to make sure that congressional intent is clarified to the agency.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate those comments. And any others? Not seeing any, but I think Erica, I may look to Bob here, but I think one thing we can do, Bob and I were discussing is staff working on something and maybe go through policy board, actually probably having a draft for the review for both of you specifically, since you're dealing with this right now. And, you know, Pat, as you mentioned, you came to us and, you know, New Jersey has dealt with this. And that would be a perfect example of where it was going to be so, you know, state specific and not as necessarily regional, but kind of a little bit out of it. Luckily, it's been a while since we've had that issue. So, Bob, what do you think about that? Maybe a draft and then we'll take it to policy board.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. We'll get, I think a reasonable timeline is we get a draft together in the next, I don't know, 2 weeks, 10 days, something like that. We'll circulate it, start with Erica and Pat. If they're fine with it, go to the full policy board. If they're fine with it, we'll send it off to our elected officials here in DC. If everybody's okay with that.
Yeah, I don't see any objections. I appreciate that. Yeah, unfortunately, it does look like this is, you know, the new norm. So we do have one other item. I think it would be nice to get a quick briefing on the annual meeting for this year, and then we will be moving into closed session after that. So I don't know if we want to kick it to Lynn or Laura. Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we are very excited to host the meeting this fall. We cannot offer the screen door factory that my colleague to the left can. But as we're waiting for that, I'm really excited. We've got I think a lovely venue for the annual dinner is going to be on the Naval Academy campus. It's gorgeous, and we are working on making it a fun event. So I don't know if there's anything else I should cover, but we are underway with the planning.
Yeah, Lynn, why don't you mention the proposal you had for something that we could do at the football stadium?
Oh, yeah. So I wonder, actually, I would be curious to get your thoughts. So I know I'd heard from several people that they really enjoyed the last time this was in Annapolis, being in the Naval Stadium to see where the games are played and all of the, it's a pretty cool place. So because the dinner is going to be on the campus of the Academy, I wondered how people would feel about doing a breakfast and maybe a 0.05K run around the track. So we could have breakfast out there. If people wanted to trot around the track, they could. We could have awards like most impractical shoes, you know, whatever. But that was an event we were sort of toying with. Feedback welcome.
Well, thanks. Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, no, it's a great spot. Folks on the mid kind of know that area well, and I think it's a great place to have meetings. So I'm excited, and I think it's a little bit easier, honestly, to get to than some DC locations that we've dealt with. So, except for Pat, as we all know, he'll find a way to have a problem getting there. So I think that's going to conclude our open session. We do have some important items to discuss and not a whole lot of time. So if we could move into a closed session, much appreciated for some of the folks in the back of the room. And online, I guess we'll be just kind of, we're going to sort of disconnect for a little bit.